Thank you. I'm going to do this because I like to walk around. It helps me think. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a perspective on human factors in healthcare and AI. Let's see. Does this advance? Not yet. Oh, there we go. Oh, back. There you go. Okay. So when I was trying to think about this, there was so much to talk about, and I didn't want to just list all the ways in which AI could help, in surgery. And I think there's a lot. What I wanted to do is actually expand on some of the ideas around human factors that we've been talking about, but some of our audience may not be familiar with. And think specifically about some aspects of surgical safety and how we understand that. And then I've got 3 specific examples that I'm going to talk about that I think would be super helpful for AI, or might be potential applications for AI. And they're slightly kind of left field, because that's part of the reason for my talk here is that if we only focus on physicians and physician decision-making and what we do, I think we're going to miss out on a whole bunch of ways in which AI could be really helpful. I'm going to talk about some of that. Because most of my work has actually not focused on like the expertise of the clinicians. It's actually about the systems in which they work. And then the final piece is I'm going to just a little piece around evaluation from the surgical sphere that might help us kind of understand a little bit more about the evidence base. Okay, so what is human factors? Understanding the interactions. So the piece here is that it's not a person or a system, it's the interaction between the human being and the world around them that we look at. Interactions among humans and elements of the system optimize human well-being and overall system performance. So, for example, I'm doing some ARC-funded work on retained foreign objects, sewing up people with things still inside them. I'm going to talk about that in a little while, but one of the things that we were saying is that even if we didn't reduce the level of retained foreign objects, actually helping clinicians feel more confident that they've done their best to do their work might not be a bad outcome. Ideally, we want to do both. But actually enhancing well-being is really important. It becomes particularly important when we start to think about technology, because technology has a habit of claiming, for example, it's going to reduce burnout and actually increasing burnout for all sorts of different reasons. So the well-being of our physicians is really central to this, and thinking that AI is naturally going to help that, we need to be careful with that assumption. Anyway, we're going to need to be careful with lots of assumptions. So I'm going to start a little bit and expand on what Sarah talked about. Our brain is amazing because it's evolved. It's evolved over millions and millions of years. It's evolved to do certain things very, very well. And so when we think of, about human factors, we think about this amazing brain. By the way, I don't believe that AI is going to, whatever we do with AI is going to replace some of the amazing things that the brain can do in any reasonable timescale, partly because there's a long history of engineers and technologists not really understanding how amazing the brain really is. If we treat the brain like it's an information processor, we will misunderstand how the brain really works. So we think about the brain at the center of the system, and that allows us to do all these amazing things when we combine it with all these different technologies that are available to us in the right ways. And so, what it does is the brain is very good at some of these things, and maybe AI can do some of these things, but maybe it can't do all of these things. It finds patterns, creates meaning, fine-tunes senses, uses automaticity, filters out irrelevant information. One of my favorite little examples is the cocktail party effect, which is where in a babble of voices, you suddenly hear from across the side of the room somebody mention your name. Right? This tells you a bunch of things about what's going on. It tells you that there's a non-conscious process that's listening to all the information that's coming into your ears all the time and deciding for you which to bring to your conscious attention. And so you're processing all sorts of information you are completely unaware of all the time. Anyway, so the brain does amazing things in ways that we're not even often aware of. Of course, there's also a history here, and where we start to think about patient safety, of things going wrong. The idea, and this stems back to the research of Perot and, of course, Jim Reason, accidents not caused by humans or technologies. We still see this narrative: was it the human or was it the technology? And from human factors and a safety science point of view, it's the wrong way to think about it. What it is, it's a mix. That we got the mix wrong between the humans and technology. And Jim Reason says, rather than being the main instigator of an accident, operators tend to be inheritors of poor systems design, incorrect installation, faulty maintenance, and bad management decisions. By and large, healthcare actually still hasn't learned any of these lessons. We still focus on human error. I annoy people by saying we shouldn't be talking about error, we should be talking about harm. There's a fundamental difference between error and harm that has, I think, been led to a catastrophic misunderstanding of patient safety, because it means we focus on reducing errors and we focus on who made the error, not on how that harm happened, because according to Perot from the, I think, 80s, error is normal. Errors happen all the time. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, socio-technical systems says that humans are a fundamental component of any system. You can't design the human out of a system. You can design them to do something different, but you always need to have humans in your system. There will need to be humans interacting with AI, operating AI, designing AI, training AI, looking at AI. So the idea that we can remove humans entirely from the system is absolutely, it's not true. So what we've got to be doing is understanding the relationship between AI and the humans. The second thing is that humans create safety in complex systems. They're not the weak part of the link, they're the strong part of the link. That if you want, because systems are inherently unsafe. It is never safe to take a knife to skin or give a patient a different drug. The only way to make a hospital safe is to lock the doors and never let anyone in. Of course, one of the differences between aviation and healthcare is that if you prevent anyone flying, then you don't have any aviation accidents. If you obviously lock the doors of the healthcare system, you will still have people dying from healthcare system, from a lack of healthcare. Anyway, so complex systems always function at the limits of their capacity. So if we get faster and better at doing things, or cheaper at doing things, we'll then ask our system to deliver more for less. So if we, for example, get faster at doing, reading radiology images, what's going to happen is we're going to ask our radiologists or our system to do more radiology reads. So, and complex systems always require safety to be traded for other aspects of system performance. In other words, that you can't have, you've got to understand the relationship between cost and throughput and safety and quality, and balance those two things and understand that it's a balance, and that we're trading off all these things all the time. Indeed, I would argue that practitioners are doing this almost all the time. They're saying to themselves, I've got this patient that I'm concerned about, so I'm going to spend more time on this patient, but I've got this patient that I think is okay, and they're a low risk, so I'm going to spend less time with that patient. That's a speed accuracy trade-off or speed thoroughness trade-off, and so that idea that we're trading systems for system performance. So Jim Reason says, because of this evolutionary thing, because we're amazing at what we do, and because that's not going to change, and because we need humans in our system, we can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under which the human works. And I think somebody else mentioned that already today. Okay, so what we get to is there's a brain at the center of the system that's interacting with something. This is a surgical robot. It might not be a surgical robot. It might not be an AI. But it's interacting with something. And it's interacting through displays and controls of various different sorts within a working environment, which affects both our ability, our technology. Some operating rooms are too small for surgical robots. Anyway, so there's interactions between these things, and we're doing that within an organization that sets certain work parameters. It sets things like the goals, the reasons why we're doing these things, the staffing that's available, the training that's available, and all of these things are interacting all the time. So this isn't just a kind of a simple thing. All of these things are moving in dynamic ways all the time. For example, if you introduce a surgical robot, suddenly you need to be not only having a room for a space for it and training surgeons, but you need to be managing and thinking about the careers of your operating room staff who are using this surgical robot, and which requires certain skills to use. It also requires things like, you end up with things like the blocking of surgical times, so it changes how you schedule surgeries. So long history of how technology has these sort of unforeseen but actually profound impacts on things well beyond what you might have considered as being interactive with it in the first place. The same will happen. The same thing it will happen with AI. The question is whether we can predict those things in any way. Okay, so socio-technical systems, complex, lots of things going on. The second thing I'm going to talk about is work imagined versus work as done. This is a key principle. The idea that when you sit in an office, or when you look at an incident report, or when you think about what people should be doing, it seems so simple. But actually, the world is a lot messier than it looks when you're sitting in your office. So, or when you're imagining what the work of somebody else is. This is one of the reasons why a significant part of our work as human factors scientists is to spend a lot of time with the people doing the work, understanding the work that they do. So this is why I spent a lot of time hanging around in operating rooms. So this is work as imagined. This is what, for example, a technology designer might think of how an operating room might look. It looks like no operating room I've ever been in and probably ever will be in. This is more like it because this is cluttered. It's got stuff in it. It's a real room. This is more like it because it's got people in it too, and lots of people, and lots of things happening all the time, doing lots and lots of different things. And these are some of the photos that I've taken from various different operating rooms and facilities in both the UK and the US, some very average hospitals, some hospitals, that think they're the best hospitals in the world. And so things like piles of kind of just stuff. This is in an operating room, the corner of an operating room. Power cables and how difficult it is to plug things in. By the way, this here is, I think, a $1 million thing. It's battery powered. And at least on one occasion, it stopped working in the middle of an operation because it hadn't been plugged in and the batteries ran out. When we talk about medication labeling, this is how medication labeling really is. So the idea here is that, and by the way, you could probably go into your own operating rooms. So this is the messy reality of working in surgery. So when we look at an incident report that says, oh, well, this person didn't do this thing, then maybe there's something more complex underlying that's creating, So essentially what we're saying is we do not live in a perfect system, and we rely on people to adapt to our imperfect systems to create safety. So if we design AI with the idea that we've got a perfect system, if only we could get the humans to do what we were going to do, what we wanted them to do, we will thoroughly misunderstand and misapply this technology. Okay. So work imagined, work is done. I think I can probably skip some of this. saying they should have done doesn't, saying protocols can't account for all eventualities, saying what they should have done. Evidence base is not nearly as great as we would like to. It's rare. It's not behaviorally motivating. People don't change their behavior based on evidence. And indeed, it's socially constructed. In the training, drift, emission, that's not, that might be how you were trained to do it, but here's how you have to do it in reality. There's this whole thing of in-service training, where I might be trained on something for 10 minutes that I might never use for 6 months. And I have to sign something that says I've been trained on it. How effective do you really think that training is? So is that training offering anything? So if you then, 6 months later, have to use whatever the device you've had an in-service in, how much of that training do you think is really helping you to understand what you need to do? And it's in the policy. Well, policies are unknowable. There's too many of them. Unknown, I didn't know there was a policy for this. It's unavailable. Yeah, I know there's a policy, but I can't get to it because it's on a PDF on a terminal somewhere when I'm doing this other work. Or it's unrealistic. It's a 30-page policy for a 3-page, for a 3-minute process. By the way, all of these things, you could start thinking about, how could AI help with this? I think there's a lot of room to think about how we can help policy, how we can, if you like, bridge the gap between work as imagined and work as done, what's happened and what we would like to happen, by things like making policies, helping AI, using AIs to help make policies more useful, more usable, more available at the right time. Anyway, so this is another thing, that clinical systems are linear and deterministic. In other words, a behavior down here leads to an outcome there. It's unfortunately not true either, that our systems are complex and adaptive. So we can make we can make a drugs error here that actually we recover from and doesn't end up, or we can be about to make a drugs error that then doesn't have an effect on the patient. So just because we have bad outcomes doesn't mean that anything went wrong with our process, and just because we have good outcomes doesn't mean our process was great in the first place. So this actually challenges a lot of evidence-based medicine when we start thinking about this. Not all of it, but it does sort of challenge the idea that we can always look at the relationship between process and outcome. My best example of this is we don't design checklists on aircraft based on a number of people who died in aircraft accidents last year. And we shouldn't be. All right, so anyway, I'm going to move on from that. So sorry, just a quick, in fact, the point I want to make about this is that, once we see healthcare less, or certain functions healthcare functions we can see as complicated, but actually healthcare is much more like an ecosystem. It's much less like a production line and much more like an ecosystem. With all these things, which means it's irreducible, it's more like a kind of organic thing. Anyway, so when we think about what people are doing, and this is my colleague Crystal Master, who's a ED doc in Kaiser, who this slide is, I attribute this slide to. So, this is work as imagined. This is how we think work, this is how work might be designed, but the blue line is what people are actually doing. And that blue line is actually what expertise is. Being able to navigate through whatever work you're in, you are, dealing with all these different unexpected, these imperfections in your system to create the outcomes that you've been asked to create. So this is about outcomes. So these are all the different outcomes. As an anesthesiologist, you might need to take into account when you deliver a drug. So for the patient, for the family, for yourself and your professional, your professional reputation, your regulatory things. It doesn't, you can have a look at it. It doesn't matter the details and the outcomes of the organization. Financial, the availability of certain drugs. The email that we got yesterday saying, we want to conserve this drug, so use this other drug. So when we think about outcomes, we've got to be very careful if we're only focusing on one outcome, that we're actually not looking at all the different outcomes. A randomized controlled trial tells you the best treatment, or gives you evidence about the best treatment for the patients in that randomized controlled trial, not necessarily your patient in your hospital at your, at the current time. So another piece of expertise is, as a clinician, being able to balance all these different outcomes to achieve the best balance of all those things. The patient, your professional duties, your regulation, the outcomes that you want to achieve, it's to be able to balance those in the best way to get the best outcome you can, given that sometimes these things are going to be in competition. Okay. So the world is not nearly as nice and neat as we'd like to think it is, which is why studying it in more detail and not making assumptions about the work that's going on is a really valuable part, and why we're all arguing that you need human factors. Because this is the kind of, a lot of sort of this difference between workers imagined and workers done is a core principle of our human factors kind of work. Another example of this, I've heard this, our technology is great, but people won't use it. Maybe it's not as great as you think it is then. Because the traditional narrative is, the new or better thing, new AI will lead to better behavior, or that will improve performance and reduce costs, okay? So you see this narrative all the time. Well, sorry to say, but that thing must be usable, used appropriately, reliable, fit into a normal working window, must be that what that thing does must be accessible, understandable, informed decision-making. That decision has to lead to a behavior change, and that behavior change has to lead to a change in outcome. Doesn't mean that any of those things are going to happen. So even if you have a behavioral change, it might not improve performance. So when we think about evaluation, this is an easy narrative. It's not, anyway, you can see the problems with it. And there's also a lot around automation that I won't get to talk in too much detail about. Just going to check on how much time I'm doing. Okay. Lots on the difference between what we hoped, on the long history of, the purported benefits of automation and the realities, which is all these things, including de-skilling, including not reducing complexity but increasing complexity, not reducing the need for skill but actually requiring more skill because you need to be able to do the primary job and understand whatever your technology is that you're using, all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot in the difference between the expectations of automation and what it really delivers. And I was about 5 or 6 years ago when there was the hype around self-driving cars. I was upsetting all of my friends by saying, it's not going to be as nearly as easy as you think it is, because your brain is amazing at driving in a way that probably the engineers engineering self-driving cars don't really understand. And so if you like, I pulled this out, I really like this. To use a real example, when the road turns from wet to icy and the SUV in front of your minivan starts doing donuts in front of you, will the self-driven minivan know not to put the brakes on, but to slip the left wheels into the grassy median long enough to pass the spinning SUV, get back on the pavement and glide to a stop? So the idea here is that there's, this is a human thing. Being able to do this is actually a source of expertise. Not everyone in the room would know that that's maybe an appropriate response to that particular situation. The question is AI going to be able to do that? Anyway, so, okay. And there are also another thing to think about. This is I haven't fully developed this, but I wanted to talk about it, is that there are also levels of automation. That you can think about automation as entirely replacing the human, or as kind of advisory, or as interactive. You can think about, AI as being able to understand and take jobs off the human being, and then say, I can see you're getting a little bit, your vigilance is, now I've been doing all these things for a little while, now I've been driving your car for a little while, I can see you're getting a little sleepy. Here, I think you ought to drive again so that you're not as sleepy again. So actually, the AI can really help us if we understand that there is different levels of automation, and maybe there are different levels that are changing all the time that give us the capacity to find that right mix between humans and technology. Because the key here, there's a huge amount of human factors, sort of knowledge, is that we need to find the best mix of both, because they're not independent, they're interdependent. People adapt to technologies. That's why, anyway. So, how do we fit the technology to the people? AI gives us all sorts of opportunities to do that, and all sorts of pitfalls. And a lot of these pitfalls we already know if we take the view that we should be including human factors, people within our design team, for all these reasons. That I think the narrative around here is. Because the world is more complex than we might think it is. Okay, so how does that fit with how does that fit with advancing the slides? Is there someone? Oh, there we go. Okay, so how does that fit with surgery? And these are the things I use to. So this is kind of an example of cardiac surgery. This is an example of orthopedic surgery. The main thing I'm going to do, I usually use it to talk about kind of teamwork and how that changes. All I'm going to use it for here is to say, look, if we only focus on the surgeon, we're missing out on everything else. If we only focus on the surgeon, we're missing out on all the other things that go into a successful surgery. So if we're only looking at, and absolutely we can look at surgical robots, and absolutely we can look at imaging and different surgical techniques. But there's all these other things that go into a successful surgery, and by the way, they're interacting. So, the teamwork in cardiac surgery is fundamentally different than what good teamwork looks like in cardiac surgery, which requires this relationship between the anesthesiologist, the perfusionist, and the surgeon. Is very different from what good teamwork looks like in orthopedic surgery, where actually if you've got a scrub tech who knows about all the, how to use all the jigs and all the pieces and all the kind of bits of Meccano, the bits of technology that go into a knee replacement, you're going to have a much more successful and smooth operation. So lots and lots of things go wrong in surgery, and I haven't really sort of delved into that literature. But we know that, for example, wrong site surgery, or retained projects, which I'm working on now thanks to ARC's funding. This, by the way, is from a UK event. It's happened in the US. I think it's probably happened several times. This one is, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, one of the top 10 biggest payouts in UK medical legal history, actually a Great Ormond Street patient. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of detail. The natural reactions to failure is who did it? There was a sequence of errors. What did they do wrong? Why did this happen? What should they have done to avoid this particular situation? All these kind of are aspects of hindsight bias. Because if you want to understand how to avoid an event, it's important to understand why it made sense for the person to make these decisions that led to this bad outcome, rather than telling them afterwards that they should have done something different. So this is another way in which AI can help. If we sort of get beyond the idea of hindsight bias and saying what people should have done to understanding why it makes sense for them to do these things, it gives us a much better opportunity to think about improving safety before it happens. And so this is what Sidney Dekker calls a reconstruction of the mindset. It's really about walking in somebody else's shoes. If you take the view that nobody comes to work to do a bad job, and nobody comes to work to harm a patient, and generally, not universally, but very, 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 mostly that's true, then how did this seem reasonable? How did this reasonable person make these decisions that led to this harm is a much more effective way than saying, well, they should have done something different. Okay. Because I'm going to get into the surgery bit now if I'm not running horrendously over time, which I sort of am, but anyway. So in the same unit, I was working with the same unit 18 months before that dreadful accident that I talked about at Great Ormond Street. This is a VP shunt, so this is a neuro case, VP shunt being a tube to relieve pressure in the head down into the stomach. So in this case, there were 4 people at the operating table, new scrub nurse, new scrub tech, and 2 surgeons, actually. So there's a kind of senior surgeon who was kind of coaching a junior surgeon. So 4 people at the table when usually there would have been 2. Now, at this stage, there were lots and lots of little things going wrong. The diathermy, that's the Bovie, I think you guys call it. Cranial drill was occluded. Lots of things were not working, and they were sort of creating this general state of, and by the way, this is very frequent. I'm going to get into that in a minute. So also this team were working in a different part of the hospital. They were having to work with equipment that they weren't that happy with. And, with all this stuff going on, there's a syringe swap. Essentially, this inexperienced scrub nurse who's trying to serve 2 different surgeons at the same time hands a syringe of Chirocaine, not a syringe of saline, to wash the incision here. Now, I understand that Chirocaine, if it comes into contact with the central nervous system, is catastrophic. So this was, and so at this point we've got a syringe that we think is full of saline is going to be used down here, which is about, that far away from, kind of catastrophe. And at this point, the scrub nurse says, stop, don't do that, and recovers the problem. This happens all the time. I say happens all the time. We don't actually know how frequently this happens because this sort of thing is never reported. So I've got tons of these, I got a bunch of these stories, none of which was ever reported in any system. So the only record there is because I was hanging around in operating rooms. So this was our original stuff at Great Ormond Street. You can see the technology from the early 2000s of recording teams and looking at what they were doing. And starting to build this understanding of how errors happen, of counting all the things that people have to deal with. So equipment failure, some piece of equipment failed in every single surgery we observed. I don't know that this has changed a whole lot. Maybe it has. So the point here is there's lots and lots of things going wrong all the time that the teams have to deal with. And the theory that I'm still working on, or I still think is relevant, is that it's when these small things start to gather together in the context of something different, that's when accidents start to happen. So this was a kind of classic study done by my predecessor and my old boss, Mark de Laval, cardiac surgeon, who basically looked at all the little things that were going wrong and said, actually, these have an impact on outcome. And teamwork has a part to play in this. Small problems can escalate to more serious situations. Effective teamwork can address that. So there's an escalation. It's like a snowball. You have one small thing that leads to another small thing that leads to another small thing that can create the situations in which much more serious things start to happen. And one aspect, one reason why teams are so important is that teams have a way of mitigating that. And indeed, when we've started to look at, so one of the pieces I've started to do is look at whether AI can help us understand these cascades, how one of these small events can lead to another one. Can we start using AI to model harm escalation in surgery from this sort of observational data? And what that, we're actually trying to get this published right now, and it's been a bit of a challenge to get this published. But for example, patient factors are much more likely, so a problem with a patient is much more likely to lead to, a number of other problems within the surgery than, for example, somebody coming in and, a sort of external factor, somebody coming in and saying, hey, you're ready for your break now. That would be a sort of external factor, whereas a patient factor might be their, whatever, body habitus problems or anatomical issues. Equipment. So equipment issues tend to be within these cascades. And so we can start to use AI to help us understand maybe the causes of harm in surgery that might actually give us an opportunity to target the key things that are creating these problems. I'm going to switch on from that, and our early kind of research on this suggests that actually we can train AIs fairly well to do this. So the obvious application for AI in surgery is to help us understand not only from a kind of academic point of view how do accidents happen, but actually to act as an early warning system. Another piece of this is understanding workflow. This should be animated. Oh yeah, there we go. So this shows all the movements of all the stuff around an operating room. And to get this, I had to kind of station two researchers in here and look at how things move around and how they, I think there's a real capacity. And in fact, I was talking to an organization who have got the capacity to use AI to model this. And there's so many things we could do. One of the things that we could do with this is look at turnover. Turnover time is a key performance indicator for a surgical suite. How quick is their turnover time? And I think honestly we could use AI to look much more at that, much more sample size, much greater. What's the word? Anyway, yeah, much greater generalizability, and indeed. This is some, and again, ARC-funded work looking at anesthesia and medication delivery. This is how syringes move around operating rooms. And of course, if they move around the operating rooms and get placed in the wrong place, then you can end up with a syringe swap. This is another syringe swap I observed that didn't lead to a problem. It could have very, very nearly, very, very nearly left it. Could have led to harm, didn't lead to harm, so it wasn't reported. This was, anyway, doesn't matter. Carotid endarterectomy, where you've got to give heparin. Instead, saline was given. It could have been any drug, and because they didn't give heparin, there was a potential that this patient would have had a clot. They didn't because it was identified quickly enough. But there were two ways in which serious harm could have happened from that very simple syringe swap. I think AI has a part to play in this. And by the way, this is the complexity of clinical work, what you call task tools matrix, all the things that need to go into. So these are all the different things that an anesthesiologist has to do. These are all the things that they use to do them. So understanding this in more detail and being able to help our clinical staff, use AI to help them do this, to do these complex tasks, help them to have all the things that they need available, I think is another option. There's talk of decision-making. These are the decisions that are made and the information sources that clinicians have to go to make some of those decisions. But we need to go beyond the idea of decision-making being, oh, well, we'll just give people more information. There's so much of talk of clinical decision-making, clinical decision support, but very, very little on how clinicians actually make decisions. So if you're going to support decision-making and you haven't identified how clinicians make decisions in the first place, maybe that's a reason why people ignore BPAs. So, and there are a bunch of ways in which we can understand decision-making. It's kind of classical decision-making, signal detection theory, naturalistic decision-making. It's really, really cool. I'm really interested in this. I would love to, anyway, there's lots of human factors people who do this really well. Another one is distributed cognition, how decisions are not, distributed amongst technologies and people. It's not just about one clinic. So, for example, when we think about diagnosis, it's not just one person making one diagnosis at one point, that actually the ability to diagnose is distributed amongst a bunch of different people and a bunch of different systems and a bunch of different technologies. And so that gives us an insight into why maybe diagnostic error is the wrong way to think about it. Anyway, sorry, too much here. This is the relationship between failing devices and the cognitive in anesthesia. So these are all the anesthesia devices that might be used. These are all the ways in which they can fail. Almost universally, these incidents where a patient is harmed, they're described as clinical decision-making failure. The number of devices that fail and how they're badly designed is hidden by this focus on error, and it's by this focus on decision-making failure, or situational awareness failure is the one other thing that you see. Another way to look at this is that another form of expertise is anesthesiologists knowing these are all the ways in which these devices fail and navigating around that. Same with AI. If you want to have an effective AI, helping the clinician understand how it's going to fail and navigate around that so that they have protections against those failures might be an important thing to think about. Particularly actually given if you're building an AI on top of things like vital signs monitoring, but vital signs monitoring is far from 100% reliable. Or indeed data sets built on that. Anyway. How am I doing? I think I'm running out. I think I've profoundly run out of time. Oh no, I've got 2 minutes. So if you want to make any surgeon in the Western world, and I have a theory, if you want to make any surgeon in the Western world roll their eyes, talk about preference cards. Preference cards there you go, thank you, perfect reaction. So there are two things to think about here. Okay, what are preference cards? Preference cards are the list of things that a surgeon, the supplies and instruments that a surgeon, wants to do their surgery. The reason why they roll their eyes, it's notoriously unreliable. The reason why I think it's really interesting is because I've sat in rooms where, with people saying, oh, well, we've just got to solve the preference card problem, and then all our problems will be over. Well, okay, if you solve the preference card problem, you would make every single surgeon in the Western world very, very happy. Now, it's a systemic problem. I don't think it's unsolvable. And I think AI has a role to play here. So when we think about surgical safety, actually, I think there's a lot to do well beyond, thinking about surgery and surgeons. So this is some work we're doing on sterile processing. Again, much gratefully funded by ARC, because this is around how surgeons cannot do surgery without the right instrumentation. And about 1 in every 100 cases, dirty instruments turn back up in the operating room. About 1 in every 10 cases, you have broken or missing instruments in the operating room. So getting the instruments for the surgery, for surgeons to do their surgery is an critical part of patient safety, and yet almost entirely ignored. The reason why I'm doing research in it is because we had a problem, and I realized almost nobody had looked at this. Despite thousands of papers on surgical safety, there was almost nothing on sterile processing and how we provide instruments safely and appropriately for surgeons to do their work. And so thank you for ARC for funding, for taking a chance on that. There's lots of really interesting features of this. They're often low-paid staff, but they have to be highly technically competent. It's also supposedly process-oriented, though not, so not quite as much as we'd like. There's actually a lot of perturbations to this, but there's tons and tons and tons of data around how trays move around and how instruments move around. So I think there's so much that could be done, and I imagine that most organizations have the problems that we've identified at MUSC with sterile processing, because I know at least 4 other organizations I'm working with who have challenges with this. Anyway, I'm sorry I've run out of time to talk about this, but there are all sorts of opportunities, for example, for AI to help differentiate between a tray that arrives back from the operating room in the right configuration versus in these dangerous configurations. This obviously leaves incredible opportunities for things like sharps and missing instruments and needle stick injuries and that kind of thing. But also how the trays move around and finding trays within an organization is really challenging. More than that, though, is that this gives us an opportunity to help people in the C-suite understand the decisions that they make, how the financial and throughput decisions they make might have on error in sterile processing. For example, C-suites decides, right, we want to have 3 more orthopedic surgeons, because orthopedics makes us a lot of money. We're going to have 3 more orthopedic surgeons. But we're not going to buy the instrumentation that supports those extra 3 orthopedic surgeons, partly because SPD's budget doesn't cover that. They have a certain budget, but we made an organizational decision, but haven't actually understood that that's going to have an impact on how quickly, therefore, we need to move our trays through, because we haven't got any more trays. So we've got to move those trays through, which will obviously lead to the greater opportunity for something to go wrong. And so helping the C-suite through things like modeling that we're trying to do, and I think there's, again, a wonderful opportunity for AI, helping the C-suite to understand how the decisions about finances or throughput or specialties might have an impact on the consistent, the problems that they're seeing in sterile processing, is another hope that I have both for our research, but actually more generally for AI. The final thing I was going to talk about was RFO prevention, and I'm already over time. The key here is that the surgical count, which is what people associate with accounting for surgical instruments so we don't sew up people with things still inside them, ends up, of course, being actually a much more complex systems problem than you think it is. And that the policies and procedures, the best practice guidance doesn't actually fit the messy reality of doing this work. Not least of which is, if you have a surgical site pen and you mark a surgical site, you take the lid off, is that 1 object or 2 objects? And I think that there's a lot of capacity for AI to help us with this, for helping track the movement of instruments, because the technologies that we've been looking at are not so far particularly sufficient to do this job. this particular technology probably worked really well in a lab, but once you soak it in blood, it takes greater than 3 seconds to scan a single sponge. So in fact, what it ends up doing is creating a lot more delays and a lot more frustration between the surgeons who want to get finished and the nurses who are like, I want to get the count right, and I've got to use this count machine. But whereas normally I could count, whatever, 7, 8 sponges in 3 seconds, it's taking, taking more than 3 seconds to count one. So I think there's a lot of work we could do with technology to really help with retained foreign objects. Okay, the final piece of this, and I need to, is that I think there are also evaluation frameworks. When I talked at the start about the relationship between sort of process and outcome, the ideal framework for surgical evaluation might be very valuable, because really it looks at the different evidence at the different stages as you roll out, from like the very early prototypes to the specialists in your unit who are using this prototype, to then spreading that to everyone in the unit, or to everyone beyond that in an organization who might have a different kind of perspective, who might use that device in a different way, and how you study that long term. So actually there's tons of stuff in this that we could do to help get better at that, those different evaluation points, which, by the way, would match with surgeons' perceptions of how we evaluate these things as well. Okay, there are lots of challenges. There were lots of challenges. I think fundamentally the biggest challenge is misunderstanding the context in which our AI is going to be applied. But thank you so much, and as well as Terry recommending design of everyday things, I would also, if you're interested, Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Human Error is awesome too. Thank you so much. Sorry if I've overrun.